My name is Jessica, and I'm 32 years old. For 12 years, I believed that proving my independence meant never asking for help, never showing weakness, and never giving my parents the satisfaction of being right about anything. I built an empire from nothing, clawed my way through college with 3 jobs, and created a life that most people only dream of achieving. I thought success was the best revenge against parents who threw me out with nothing but a suitcase and $27 to my name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I thought I had won by becoming everything they said I'd never be. Until the day my phone rang with news that made me realize who really holds the power in our twisted family dynamic. The conversation that followed would force me to make a choice that revealed the true cost of cutting people off completely. Let me take you back to where this all began, in a sprawling suburban neighborhood outside Phoenix, Arizona, where appearances mattered more than authenticity, and keeping up with the neighbors was practically a competitive sport. Growing up in the Henderson household meant understanding that love came with conditions, support had strings attached, and every privilege could be revoked at a moment's notice if you didn't live up to the impossibly high standards that my parents, David and Margaret Henderson, had set for their only daughter. My father, David, was a successful corporate lawyer who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits and carried himself like he owned every room he entered. His corner office downtown overlooked the city, skyline, and he never let anyone forget that he had earned every square foot of that view through sheer determination and strategic thinking. David believed that success was a choice, that poor people simply lacked the discipline to make better decisions, and that anyone who struggled financially was probably too lazy or too stupid to deserve better. These weren't just his political opinions. They were the core beliefs that shaped how he raised me. Margaret, my mother, was the perfect complement to David's ambition. She had given up her career as a marketing executive when they got married, transforming herself into the ideal corporate wife who could host dinner parties that impressed David's colleagues and maintain a social calendar that elevated their family's status in the community. Margaret volunteered for the right charities, belonged to the country club, and made sure our house was featured in the annual neighborhood garden tour every spring. She was beautiful, articulate, and utterly devoted to maintaining the Henderson family image. From my earliest memories, I understood that being their daughter meant representing the family brand wherever I went. My clothes had to be perfect, my grades had to be exceptional, and my behavior had to be beyond reproach. Other kids could have tantrums in grocery stores or wear mismatched socks to school, but Jessica Henderson was held to a different standard. I learned to smile politely when adults spoke to me, to speak only when spoken to during dinner parties, and to never, ever embarrass my parents in public. The pressure to excel wasn't subtle or gentle. It was a constant, suffocating presence that followed me through every aspect of my childhood. When I brought home a report card with 5 A's and 1 B+, David would ask me to explain why I hadn't earned straight A's. When I won second place in the school science fair, Margaret would suggest that maybe I hadn't prepared thoroughly enough for first place. When other parents bragged about their children's accomplishments, mine would smile and nod while privately, telling me that I needed to work harder to stand out from the competition. Piano lessons started when I was 5, not because I showed any particular musical aptitude, but because Margaret believed that classical music training would give me cultural sophistication that would serve me well in elite social circles. Tennis lessons followed at age 7, because David thought competitive sports would teach me strategic thinking and mental toughness. Academic tutoring began in middle school, even though my grades were already excellent, because my parents wanted to ensure I would be competitive for admission to prestigious universities. Every activity, every lesson, every opportunity came with explicit expectations about performance and implicit threats about what would happen if I failed to meet their standards. I didn't just take piano lessons. I was expected to perform at recitals without mistakes and to practice for at least an hour every day without being reminded. I didn't just play tennis. I was expected to make the high school varsity team and to compete in regional tournaments that would look impressive on college applications. I didn't just attend tutoring sessions. I was expected to maintain perfect grades while taking the most challenging courses available. The message was always clear. Our support comes with conditions, and those conditions are non-negotiable. David and Margaret weren't just investing in my education and development. They were building a return on investment that would reflect well on their parenting and their family's status. I was their project, their proof of concept, their demonstration to the world that the Henderson family produced exceptional results. High school was when the pressure reached levels that probably should have concerned someone, but my parents saw my stress and anxiety as evidence that I was taking their expectations seriously. I was enrolled in 6 advanced placement courses. My senior year, captain of the debate team, first chair violin in the school orchestra, and ranked 3rd in my graduating class of 412 students. I spent my afternoons at tennis practice, my evenings at debate team meetings or orchestra rehearsals, and my weekends at academic competitions or volunteer activities that would strengthen my college applications. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I was surviving on 4 or 5 hours per night, fueled by energy drinks and the constant fear of disappointing my parents. My social life was virtually non-existent because every spare moment was dedicated to maintaining the level of achievement that David and Margaret expected from their daughter. While my classmates were going to movies or hanging out at the mall, I was writing essays, practicing violin, or studying for tests that would determine my class rank. The college application process was treated like a military campaign in our household. David had researched the admission requirements for every Ivy League university and several other prestigious institutions, creating spreadsheets that tracked application deadlines, required test scores, and acceptance rates. Margaret had compiled a list of extracurricular activities and volunteer experiences that would demonstrate my well-roundedness and commitment to community service. Together, they had designed what they believed was a foolproof strategy for getting me accepted to a top-tier university with a full scholarship. Harvard was their first choice, not because they had asked me what I wanted to study or where I felt I would thrive, but because Harvard represented the pinnacle of academic achievement and social status. A Harvard acceptance letter would validate everything they had invested in my education and prove to their friends and colleagues that the Henderson family produced extraordinary results. Yale and Princeton were acceptable alternatives. Stanford was a distant 4th choice, and anything below that level was considered failure. I applied to 14 schools, a mix of reach schools, target schools, and what David called safety schools, with such disdain that I knew he would consider it a personal embarrassment if I ended up attending one of them. The application process consumed our family life for months. Every essay was reviewed and revised multiple times. Every interview was practiced until I could recite my answers perfectly, and every piece of supporting documentation was scrutinized to ensure it presented me in the most favorable possible light. When the acceptance letters started arriving in the spring of my senior year, the results were better than we had dared to hope. I was accepted to 11 of the 14 schools I had applied to, including Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. But there was a problem that David and Margaret hadn't anticipated in all their careful planning. None of the top schools offered me enough financial aid to make attendance affordable. Despite David's successful law practice and Margaret's family money, they had somehow convinced themselves that we would qualify for need-based financial aid at elite universities. When the financial aid letters arrived with offers that covered only a fraction of the total costs, my parents found themselves facing a choice they hadn't expected to make. They could either pay full tuition at a prestigious university, which would cost them nearly $200,000 over 4 years, or I could attend one of the state schools that had offered me full scholarships. The family meetings that followed those financial aid letters revealed a side of my parents that I had never seen before. David, who had always preached about the importance of investing in education and never settling for mediocrity, suddenly became very concerned about The practical costs of a private university education. Margaret, who had spent years talking about the social connections and networking opportunities that came with attending prestigious institutions, started researching the career outcomes of graduates from state universities. For weeks, our table conversations revolved around cost-benefit analyses of different educational options. David would pull out calculators and spreadsheets, showing me how much money I would save by attending a state school, and how that savings could be invested for my future. Margaret would share articles about successful people who had attended public universities, trying to convince me that prestige wasn't everything and that I could achieve my goals regardless of where I went to college. But I could see through their sudden change of heart. They had pushed me to achieve at the highest levels, had demanded excellence in everything I did, and had built their own identities around having a daughter who was destined for greatness. Now that the bill had arrived for turning those dreams into reality, they were discovering that their commitment to my success had limits that were measured in dollars and cents. The conversations became increasingly tense as the deadline for college enrollment decisions approached. David started, suggesting that maybe I should consider less expensive career paths that wouldn't require such a substantial educational investment. Margaret began talking about the benefits of staying closer to home, where I would have family support and wouldn't accumulate massive student debt. They were trying to reframe their financial limitations as wisdom and their reluctance to pay as protection for my future financial security. I felt like I was watching my parents reveal their true priorities in real time. Everything they had taught me about excellence, achievement, and never settling for second best was apparently subject to their personal cost-benefit analysis. The standards they had held me to throughout my childhood were standards they weren't willing to finance when it came time to put their money where their expectations had been. The breaking point came during a family dinner in late April, just weeks before I needed to make my final college decision. I had been accepted to Harvard with minimal financial aid, and I was trying to explain to my parents how important this opportunity was and how we could potentially make the finances work through a combination of student loans, work-study programs, and family contribution. I had researched every possible funding option, had calculated exactly how much debt I would graduate with, and had prepared a presentation showing them how a Harvard degree would pay for itself through higher earning potential over the course of my career. David listened to my entire presentation without interrupting, his expression growing more stern with every slide I showed him. When I finished, he set down his fork and looked at me with a coldness that I had never seen before. "Jessica," he said, his voice carrying the same tone he used with opposing counsel in contentious negotiations, "you need to understand something about the real world. Success isn't about the name on your diploma. It's about making smart financial decisions and not letting your ego drive you into debt that will cripple your future." Margaret nodded in agreement, adding that plenty of successful people had graduated from state universities and that I was being naive if I thought a Harvard degree was worth going into massive debt. They tag-teamed me with practical arguments about interest rates, loan payments, and the burden that educational debt would place on my future family. They made it sound like choosing Harvard would be an act of financial irresponsibility that would prove I hadn't learned the lessons they had tried to teach me about money management and practical decision-making. But I knew this wasn't really about financial responsibility or protecting my future. This was about my parents realizing that their investment in my achievement had reached the point where they would have to make real sacrifices to continue funding my success. They had been happy to spend money on piano lessons and tennis coaching, and academic tutoring when those investments were relatively small, and when my achievements reflected well on their parenting. But now that the investment required for the next level of achievement was substantial enough to impact their own lifestyle and financial security, they were discovering that their commitment to my excellence had limits. The argument that followed was unlike anything we had ever experienced as a family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I accused them of moving the goalposts, of raising me to believe that achievement was the most important thing in life, and then abandoning me when it came time to finance the achievement they had demanded. David accused me of being entitled and unrealistic, of expecting them to sacrifice their financial security for my educational fantasies. Margaret tried to play peacemaker, suggesting that we all needed to calm down and think about this rationally, but her attempts at mediation only made the conflict more heated. I pointed out that they had spent more money on Margaret's car than Harvard would cost for 1 year, and that they had recently renovated their kitchen for an amount that would cover my entire first-year tuition. David responded by telling me that those were their money and their decisions, and that I had no right to dictate how they chose to spend their resources. Margaret added that they had already invested thousands of dollars in my education and development, and that I was being ungrateful for everything they had already done for me. The conversation spiraled into territory that revealed fundamental disagreements about family obligations, parental responsibility, and what my parents owed me versus what I owed them. I believed that their years of pushing me toward academic excellence had created an implicit promise that they would support me in achieving the goals they had set for me. They believed that their obligation to fund my education ended when I turned 18, and that any additional support was a gift rather than a responsibility. David finally ended the argument by standing up from the dinner table and delivering an ultimatum that would change everything between us. "Jessica," he said, his voice sharp with finality, "you have two choices. You can accept our decision about what we're willing to pay for your education, or you can find another way to finance your dreams. But you will not manipulate us or guilt us into making financial decisions that we're not comfortable with." Margaret tried to soften his words, explaining that they loved me and wanted what was best for me, but that they also had to consider their own financial future and retirement planning. She suggested that maybe we could revisit the Harvard option in a year or two, after I had proven myself at a state university, and after they had more clarity about their financial situation. But I could see that this wasn't about temporary financial constraints or needing more time to plan. This was about my parents drawing a line between their commitment to my success and their commitment to their own comfort and security. They had spent 18 years teaching me that settling for less than the best was unacceptable, and now they were asking me to settle because paying for the best was inconvenient for them. The next few weeks were filled with tense negotiations and failed compromises. I researched every possible scholarship opportunity, applied for private educational loans, and even looked into military service options that would pay for college in exchange for a commitment to serve after graduation. My parents watched these efforts with what seemed like mild interest, occasionally offering suggestions but never offering to increase their financial contribution to make my Harvard dreams achievable. As the deadline for college enrollment decisions approached, I realized that my parents had made their choice and were waiting for me to accept reality and choose the state school option they preferred. They seemed to believe that once I got over my disappointment about Harvard, I would recognize the wisdom of their financial caution and thank them for protecting me from excessive student debt. But something had fundamentally shifted in my understanding of who my parents were and what our relationship actually meant. For 18 years, I had believed that their love and support were unconditional, that their investment in my success was a reflection of their commitment to helping me achieve my full potential. The college funding crisis had revealed that their support was actually quite conditional, limited by their personal financial priorities and subject to their approval of my choices. I made my decision on a warm May evening, just 3 days before the enrollment deadline. I had been accepted to Harvard. I had researched every possible funding option, and I had calculated exactly what it would take to make this opportunity work. The numbers were daunting, but not impossible. I would graduate with significant debt, but I would also graduate with a degree that would open doors that might never be available to me again. I told my parents that I was going to Harvard, with or without their financial support. I had secured enough loans and grants to cover the first year, and I would figure out the remaining 3 years as I went. David's response was immediate and brutal. "If you make this choice," he said, "don't expect us to bail you out when you realize you can't afford it. You'll be on your own financially, and you'll have to live with the consequences of your decision. Margaret tried to talk me out of it one more time, painting vivid pictures of the debt burden I would be carrying and the financial stress that would dominate my 20s. She reminded me that I had full scholarship offers from excellent state universities and that I was throwing away guaranteed financial security for an uncertain gamble on prestige and networking opportunities that might not pay off. But I had made my choice, and I was prepared to live with the consequences. I enrolled at Harvard, signed the loan documents, and began preparing for a college experience that would be entirely self-funded and self-directed. My parents' reaction was swift and final. If I was determined to make adult decisions against their advice, they said, then I could live with those decisions like an adult, without their financial safety net or emotional support. The week before I left for college was the strangest week of my life. I was living in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of 18 years of family life, while simultaneously preparing for a complete break from everything that had defined my identity up to that point. My parents were polite but distant, treating me like a houseguest who had overstayed her welcome rather than their daughter who was about to leave for college. David helped me carry my suitcases to the car on the day I left for Harvard, but his assistance felt mechanical rather than affectionate. Margaret gave me a brief hug goodbye, but her words were practical reminders about managing my finances and staying safe, rather than expressions of love or pride. There were no tears, no expressions of how much they would miss me, and no promises to visit or call regularly. As I drove away from the house where I had spent my entire childhood, I understood that I was truly on my own in a way that most 18-year-olds never experience. I had chosen a path that my parents disapproved of, and they had responded by withdrawing not just their financial support but their emotional support as well. The safety net that I had always assumed would be there if I needed. It was gone, replaced by a clear message that I would succeed or fail entirely based on my own efforts and decisions. The drive to Boston took me 3 days, partly because I couldn't afford to fly, and partly because I needed the time to process what had just happened to my family relationships. I had always known that my parents had high expectations and strong opinions, but I hadn't understood that their love was conditional on my compliance with their preferences. The college funding crisis had forced all of us to reveal our true priorities, and those priorities turned out to be fundamentally incompatible. I spent those 3 days driving across the country, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, and trying to prepare myself for a future that would be entirely of my own making. I was excited about Harvard, terrified about the financial challenges ahead, and heartbroken about the family relationships that had been sacrificed along the way. But I was also filled with a strange sense of liberation that came from knowing exactly where I stood and what I could expect from the people who had raised me. When I finally arrived at Harvard and began the process of moving into my dormitory, I realized that I was starting completely fresh in a way that few of my classmates would experience. I had no family financial support to fall back on, no regular phone calls from parents checking on my progress, and no expectation that anyone would rescue me if I struggled academically or financially. Everything about my college experience would depend entirely on my own efforts, my own decisions, and my own ability to navigate challenges without help. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in my life, I could make choices based purely on what I wanted, rather than what would please my parents or meet their expectations. But I also knew that every mistake I made would have consequences that I would have to handle entirely on my own, without the safety net that most college students took for granted. As I unpacked my belongings in my tiny dormitory room, I found myself thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment, and wondering what the next 4 years would teach me about independence, resilience, and the true cost of choosing your own destiny over family approval. I had won the battle over college choice, but I had lost something precious in the process. Whether that trade-off would ultimately be worth it remained to be seen. That first night at Harvard, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar place, I realized that I had just begun the most challenging and potentially rewarding chapter of my life. I was completely alone, completely responsible for my own success or failure, and completely free to become whoever I chose to be. The adventure that followed would test everything I thought I knew about myself, my capabilities, and what I was willing to sacrifice to achieve the life I wanted to live. Those first few months at Harvard were a masterclass in survival that no orientation program could have prepared me for. While my dorm mates were adjusting to cafeteria food and doing their own laundry for the first time, I was learning how to stretch $20 across an entire week, how to find the cheapest textbooks without falling behind in class, and how to maintain the appearance of belonging in a world where most students had trust funds larger than the debt I was accumulating. The financial reality of my situation hit me immediately. My student loans covered tuition and basic room and board, but everything else required creativity and constant hustle. I couldn't afford the meal plan that most students took for granted, so I survived on ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever free food I could find at campus events. I learned which dining halls had the most generous portions for guest passes, which study groups met in rooms where snacks were provided, and which professors kept candy bowls in their offices. My wardrobe consisted of whatever I had brought from home, supplemented by finds from thrift stores and the occasional splurge on clearance items when I had saved enough from my work-study job. While other students were shopping in Harvard Square boutiques or ordering clothes online with their parents' credit cards, I was becoming an expert at making 3 outfits look like 10 through strategic mixing and careful maintenance. The work-study program became my lifeline, but it also meant that my days were scheduled down to the minute. I worked in the library during the evenings, shelving books and helping students with research requests. The pay was minimal, but it was steady, and it gave me access to a quiet place to study when my roommate's social schedule made our dorm room unusable. I picked up additional hours during exam periods when the library stayed open later, and I volunteered for shifts during school breaks when most work-study students went home to their families. But the financial challenges were only part of the adjustment I was facing. The social dynamics at Harvard revealed class differences that I had never experienced so directly. Most of my classmates came from families where attending an elite university was expected rather than extraordinary, where study abroad programs and unpaid internships were financially feasible options, and where networking meant connecting with family friends rather than building relationships from scratch. I learned to navigate conversations about spring break plans by focusing on my work schedule rather than my inability to afford travel. I mastered the art of declining invitations to expensive restaurants by claiming I had already eaten or wasn't feeling well. I became skilled at participating in study groups that met in coffee shops by ordering a single cup of coffee and nursing it for hours, while my classmates bought multiple drinks and expensive pastries without thinking about the cost. The academic workload at Harvard was intense in ways that my high school achievements hadn't fully prepared me for. Every student in my classes had been at the top of their high school class, which meant that the competition was unlike anything I had experienced before. Professors expected not just excellence, but original thinking, sophisticated analysis, and the kind of intellectual confidence that comes from years of being encouraged to express complex ideas. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I couldn't afford to fail any classes because repeating coursework would extend my time at Harvard and increase my debt burden beyond what I could manage. I spent countless hours in the library, reading not just the required materials, but every supplementary source I could find, determined to compensate for any gaps in my preparation through sheer effort and determination. My professors began to notice my dedication, and several of them took an interest in my academic development that went beyond what they offered to typical students. Professor Williams in my economics course started recommending additional reading, materials, and invited me to attend guest lectures by visiting scholars. Professor Chen in my literature seminar encouraged me to submit papers to undergraduate research competitions and helped me refine my writing style for academic publication. These mentoring relationships became crucial to my success, not just academically, but professionally. When my classmates were securing summer internships through family connections, I was relying on professor recommendations and the relationships I had built through my academic performance. The professors who had noticed my work ethic and intellectual curiosity became my advocates, helping me access opportunities that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional networking. The summer after my freshman year presented a new set of challenges. Most students went home to spend time with their families, took unpaid internships that would enhance their resumes, or participated in study abroad programs that broadened their perspectives. I needed to find work that would help me save money for the following academic year, while also providing experience that would be valuable for my future career goals. I ended up working 2 jobs in Boston, staying in a sublet apartment that I shared with 3 other students who couldn't afford to go home for the summer. During the day, I worked as a research assistant for a small consulting firm that specialized in healthcare policy analysis. The work was intellectually stimulating and directly related to my academic interests, but the pay was modest and the hours were long. In the evenings and on weekends, I worked at a high-end restaurant in Back Bay, serving tables to tourists and business travelers who tipped well enough to help me build a small savings account. The restaurant job was particularly eye-opening because it gave me a different perspective on the wealthy professionals and executives who made up a significant portion of Harvard's donor base and alumni network. I served meals that cost more than my weekly grocery budget to people who discussed business deals and investment strategies with casual confidence. I learned to anticipate their needs, to provide the kind of polished service they expected, and to remain invisible while listening to conversations that revealed how wealth and power actually functioned in the real world. Those summer jobs taught me valuable lessons about professional behavior, customer service, and the importance of building relationships with people at every level of an organization. The consulting firm showed me how analytical skills could be applied to real-world problems, while the restaurant taught me how to perform under pressure and how to read people's personalities quickly and accurately. When I returned to Harvard, for my sophomore year, I felt more confident about my ability to handle both the academic and financial challenges of my education. I had proven to myself that I could support myself through a combination of work and careful budgeting, and I had gained professional experience that set me apart from classmates who had spent their summer at unpaid internships or family vacations. My academic performance continued to improve as I became more comfortable with the intellectual demands of my coursework. I declared my major in economics with a focus on public policy, drawn to questions about inequality, opportunity, and the role of education in social mobility. My professors encouraged me to pursue research projects that examined the relationships between educational access, economic outcomes, and family background, topics that resonated deeply with my own experiences. The research I conducted during my sophomore and junior years became the foundation for my senior thesis, which examined the long-term financial impacts of student debt on career choices and family formation. I interviewed dozens of recent graduates about their post-college decisions, analyzing how debt burden influenced their choices about graduate school, job selection, geographic mobility, and major life milestones like marriage and home ownership. The thesis research was personally meaningful because it helped me understand my own situation within a broader context of social and economic trends. I wasn't the only student making significant sacrifices to afford elite education, and the challenges I was facing weren't simply personal failings, but symptoms of larger systemic issues around educational financing and family support structures. My professors were impressed with the rigor and originality of my research, and Professor Williams encouraged me to submit portions of my thesis to academic conferences and journals. When my paper was accepted for presentation at a national economics conference during my senior year, I felt like I had achieved something that proved my intellectual capability beyond any doubt. But even as my academic success was building momentum, the absence of family support continued to affect me in ways that I was only beginning to understand. During family weekend events, when parents visited campus to attend lectures and meet with professors, I volunteered to work extra shifts at the library rather than confronting the loneliness of having no family members to invite. During graduation, preparation activities that involved family participation, I focused on post-graduation planning and job searching instead of dwelling on the ceremonial aspects that I would experience alone. My classmates often asked about my family, particularly when they noticed that I never went home for holidays or mentioned parents during casual conversations. I developed practiced responses that deflected curiosity without revealing the full story of what had happened between my parents and me. I would say that my family lived far away and that travel was complicated, or that we weren't very close, but that I preferred to focus on building my own life rather than dwelling on family relationships. The truth was more complicated than those. Simple explanations suggested I missed having people who were genuinely invested in my success and proud of my achievements. I missed having a safety net of unconditional support that I could rely on during particularly stressful periods. I missed the casual intimacy of family relationships, the inside jokes and shared memories that created a sense of belonging and continuity. But I also recognized that the independence I had been forced to develop was teaching me valuable lessons about resilience, self-reliance, and the satisfaction that comes from achieving goals through your own efforts. Every success I experienced at Harvard was entirely my own, uncontaminated by family connections or financial advantages that might have made the achievements feel less meaningful. During my junior year, I began to receive recognition that validated the path I had chosen despite my parents' disapproval. I was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa based on my academic performance, received a competitive scholarship that reduced my debt burden for my senior year, and was offered a research assistantship with a prestigious economics professor whose work on inequality had influenced national policy debates. The scholarship award ceremony was particularly meaningful because it represented recognition not just of my academic achievements, but of my potential for future contribution to economic research and policy development. When my name was called, and I walked across the stage to accept the award, I felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. I was proud of what I had accomplished through my own determination and hard work, but I was sad that the people who had raised me weren't there to witness this moment or share in my success. As my senior year progressed and graduation approached, I faced new questions about my future that most students discussed with their families. I had been accepted to several graduate programs in economics and public policy, and I had received job offers from consulting firms and policy organizations in Washington, D.C. The decisions I was making would shape the next phase of my career and potentially my entire professional trajectory. Without family input or financial support to fall back on, every choice carried weight that felt enormous. If I chose graduate school, I would be accumulating additional debt, but potentially opening doors to academic or policy careers that could have significant social impact. If I chose immediate employment, I could start paying down my undergraduate debt, but might limit my long-term career options. I found myself envying classmates who could discuss these decisions with parents who had professional experience and could provide perspective on different career paths. I wished I had family members who could offer emotional support during the stress of making these life-changing choices, even if they couldn't provide financial assistance. But I also realized that making these decisions independently was teaching me to trust my own judgment and to take full responsibility for the consequences of my choices. I was developing confidence in my ability to analyze complex situations, weigh different options, and commit to paths that aligned with my values and goals. I ultimately decided to accept a position with a policy research organization in Washington, D.C. that focused on education and economic mobility issues. The job offered the opportunity to apply my academic training to real-world problems while building professional experience that would be valuable for future graduate study or career advancement. The salary was modest, but sufficient to cover my living expenses while allowing me to make steady progress on paying down my student loans. More importantly, the work aligned with my intellectual interests and gave me the opportunity to contribute to policy discussions that could impact educational access and opportunity for future students facing challenges similar to what I had experienced. As graduation day approached, I felt a complex mixture of emotions about what I had accomplished and what I had sacrificed to reach this point. I had proven that I could succeed at the highest academic levels without family financial support, and I had developed independence and resilience that would serve me well throughout my career. But I had also experienced 4 years of Harvard without the family celebrations, emotional support, and shared pride that most students took for granted. The night before graduation, I walked around the Harvard campus one final time, reflecting on everything that had happened since that first terrifying night in my dormitory room. I had arrived as an 18-year-old who was completely dependent on her own resources for the first time in her life, and I was leaving as a 22-year-old who had proven her ability to thrive under pressure and achieve ambitious goals through determination and hard work. I thought about my parents and wondered whether they had followed my progress at Harvard, whether they felt any pride in what I had accomplished, or whether they ever regretted the choice they had made to cut me off financially and emotionally. I had sent them a graduation announcement, not because I expected them to attend, but because I wanted them to know that I had succeeded, despite their predictions about the financial burden of my educational choices. They had not responded to the announcement, and I had not heard from them at all during my 4 years at Harvard. The silence between us had become so complete that I sometimes wondered whether they thought about me at all, or whether they had simply moved on with their lives as if I had never existed. But as I prepared for graduation and the beginning of my professional career, I realized that their absence had taught me something valuable about the difference between conditional and unconditional love, between support that comes with strings attached and support that genuinely serves the best interests of the person being helped. I had learned to rely on myself, to trust my own judgment, and to find satisfaction in achievements that were entirely my own. The relationships I had built with professors, mentors, and friends at Harvard had shown me what genuine support looked like. These people had invested in my success without expecting anything in return, had celebrated my achievements without claiming credit for them, and had provided guidance without trying to control my decisions. As I fell asleep in my dormitory room for the last time, I felt grateful for the path that had brought me to this point, even though it had required sacrifices and challenges that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I had learned that independence, while sometimes lonely, could also be empowering. I had discovered that success achieved through your own efforts carries a satisfaction that success handed to you by others never could. Graduation day arrived with the kind of bright sunshine that made Harvard Yard look like a postcard. I put on my cap and gown, joined my classmates for the ceremonial procession, and prepared to celebrate an achievement that represented the culmination of 4 years of sacrifice, determination, and growth that had transformed me from a dependent teenager into a confident young adult, ready to take on the challenges of the professional world. The ceremony itself was everything I had imagined it would be, filled with inspiring speeches about public service, intellectual curiosity, and the responsibility that comes with educational privilege. When my name was called and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I felt a surge of pride that was entirely my own, uncompromised by family expectations or obligations to anyone other than myself. After the ceremony, I watched my classmates celebrate with their families, taking photos and sharing meals that marked the transition from student life to whatever came next. I felt a momentary pang of loneliness, but it was quickly replaced by excitement about the future I was about to create entirely through my own choices and efforts. That evening, I packed my belongings one final time and prepared for the drive to Washington, D.C., where I would begin my professional career. As I loaded my car with everything I owned, I reflected on how much had changed since that first drive to Harvard 4 years earlier. I was no longer the frightened teenager who had chosen independence over family approval. I was a Harvard graduate with a prestigious job, a clear sense of my professional goals, and the confidence that comes from proving you can succeed entirely on your own terms. The next chapter of my life was about to begin, and for the first time since leaving my childhood home, I felt genuinely excited about what the future might hold. Washington, D.C. welcomed me with the kind of humid summer heat that made my business suit stick to my skin during the walk from the metro station to my new office building. The policy research organization I had joined was housed in a converted brownstone near DuPont Circle, and my cubicle on the third floor had a narrow window that offered a sliver view of the bustling street below. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, earned entirely through my own merit and determination. My first assignment involved analyzing the relationship between student debt levels and post-graduation career choices, a topic that felt deeply personal given my own experience. I spent weeks diving into data sets that revealed patterns I had lived through firsthand. Students with higher debt loads were more likely to choose jobs based on salary potential rather than passion or public service interests. They delayed major life decisions like marriage and home ownership. They were less likely to pursue graduate education or take risks with entrepreneurial ventures. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being paid to research the exact challenges I had navigated for the past 4 years. But having lived through these experiences gave my analysis a depth and nuance that purely academic researchers might have missed. I could interpret the data through the lens of someone who had actually made these calculations, who had chosen financial security over idealistic career goals because the margin for error was simply too small to take risks. My supervisor, Dr. Patricia Martinez, noticed the quality of my work immediately. She was a former congressional staffer who had transitioned to policy research after becoming frustrated with the political constraints on evidence-based decision-making. During our weekly meetings, she would challenge me to think beyond the data patterns to consider the broader policy implications of my findings. Dr. Martinez became the first professional mentor who seemed genuinely invested in my career development without any ulterior motives. She encouraged me to present my research at conferences, helped me refine my policy writing skills, and introduced me to other researchers and policymakers whose work aligned with my interests. Under her guidance, I began to see how my personal experiences could inform broader policy discussions about educational access and student debt relief. The work was intellectually stimulating, but the salary barely covered my living expenses in one of the most expensive cities in the country. I found a studio apartment in a neighborhood that was transitioning from sketchy to trendy, sharing the building with young professionals, graduate students, and longtime residents who were watching their community change around them. My apartment was tiny but clean, furnished with pieces I found on Craigslist and items donated by colleagues who were upgrading their own living situations. I developed a strict budget that allocated every dollar to specific categories: rent, groceries, transportation, student loan payments, and a small emergency fund. Entertainment meant free museums, happy hour appetizers that could substitute for dinner, and house parties where everyone contributed something to share. I learned to find pleasure in simple luxuries like fresh flowers from the farmer's market or a bottle of wine that cost more than $10. The social dynamics in Washington were unlike anything I had experienced at Harvard. The city was full of ambitious young professionals who were all trying to build careers that would eventually lead to positions of influence and power. Networking wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for career advancement. Every happy hour, every professional event, every casual conversation could potentially lead to opportunities or connections that would shape your future trajectory. I approached networking with the same strategic thinking I had applied to everything else in my life. I attended events hosted by policy organizations, professional associations, and alumni groups. I volunteered for causes I cared about, knowing that the relationships I built through shared work would be more meaningful than superficial connections made over cocktails. I made an effort to be genuinely helpful to others, understanding that Professional relationships should be mutually beneficial rather than purely transactional. My Harvard degree opened doors that would have remained closed to someone with my financial background, but without elite educational credentials. When I introduced myself at professional events, people immediately made assumptions about my family background and connections that weren't accurate but worked in my favor. I learned to navigate these assumptions carefully, neither confirming nor correcting misperceptions that helped me access opportunities I wouldn't have otherwise had. After 18 months in my first job, I was recruited by a larger policy research institute that offered a significant salary increase and the opportunity to lead my own research projects. The new position involved analyzing education policy, proposals for congressional committees and executive branch agencies, work that put me at the center of national policy debates that could affect millions of students. The transition to a leadership role required skills I had been developing throughout my career, but had never been forced to demonstrate so directly. I needed to manage research teams, present findings to high-level government officials, and translate complex academic research into policy recommendations that could be implemented in the real world. The pressure was intense, but I thrived on the challenge and the opportunity to contribute to discussions that could create meaningful change. My expertise in education policy and student debt issues made me a sought-after voice in policy circles. I was invited to testify before congressional subcommittees, participate in expert panels, and contribute to reports that informed major legislation. When student debt relief became a hot topic in national politics, my research was cited in newspapers, academic journals, and policy briefs that reached decision-makers across the government. The professional recognition was gratifying, but it also highlighted the distance that had grown between my current life and my family background. I was regularly quoted in major newspapers, invited to speak at prestigious conferences, and consulted by senior government officials on policy issues that affected millions of Americans. Yet my parents had no idea about any of these achievements because we hadn't spoken in over a decade. I occasionally wondered whether they followed my career through Google searches or social media, whether they felt any pride in what I had accomplished despite their predictions about my financial irresponsibility, or whether they ever regretted the choice they had made to cut me off completely. But I had learned to find validation in my work itself, rather than seeking approval from people who had proven their support was conditional on my compliance with their preferences. My personal life during these years was complicated by the demands of my career and the emotional walls I had built around family relationships. I dated occasionally, but I struggled with intimacy that required vulnerability about my background and family situation. It was easier to keep relationships casual than to explain why I never talked about my parents, why I spent holidays alone, or why I had no family photos in my apartment. I formed close friendships with colleagues and neighbors who became my chosen family in Washington. These relationships were built on shared interests, mutual respect, and genuine affection rather than biological obligation or historical connection. When I needed emotional support during stressful periods at work, when I wanted to celebrate professional achievements, or when I simply craved companionship during lonely weekends, these friends provided the kind of unconditional support that I had once expected from my biological family. The financial security I achieved through my career advancement allowed me to pay off my student loans ahead of schedule, a milestone that felt more significant than any professional recognition I had received. The final payment represented not just the end of a debt obligation, but the completion of a journey that had begun with my parents' ultimatum about college funding. I had proven that their financial support hadn't been necessary for my success, and I had achieved my educational and career goals without compromising my principles or accepting their conditions. With my student loans paid off, I was able to save money for the first time since high school. I opened investment accounts, contributed to retirement funds, and began building the kind of financial security that my parents had claimed to prioritize when they refused to support my Harvard education. The irony was satisfying in a way that I tried not to dwell on too much, but I couldn't help noting that my financial position at 30 was probably stronger than theirs had been at the same age. My career continued to advance as I gained recognition as one of the leading experts on education policy and economic mobility issues. I was recruited by think tanks, universities, and consulting firms that offered increasingly attractive positions. I chose opportunities based on intellectual challenge and potential for impact rather than salary alone, a luxury that my financial security had finally made possible. At 31, I accepted a position as Director of Education Policy Research at a prominent think tank that gave me the resources to pursue long-term research projects and the platform to influence national policy discussions. The position came with a substantial salary, comprehensive benefits, and the kind of professional prestige that opened doors throughout Washington's policy community. I moved into a beautiful townhouse in a historic neighborhood, the first home I had ever owned and the physical manifestation of everything I had achieved through my own efforts. I furnished it carefully with pieces that reflected my personal taste rather than financial constraints, creating a space that felt like a sanctuary from the demands of my professional life. The house had a guest bedroom that I initially intended for visiting friends and colleagues, but it remained mostly empty because I had no family members who would ever visit. The absence of family connections became more noticeable as my professional success grew, and I had fewer practical concerns to distract me from the emotional dimensions of the choices I had made. I began receiving invitations to social events that included spouses and family members, professional gatherings where colleagues brought their parents or siblings, and holiday parties where family relationships were assumed to be part of everyone's life story. I developed strategies for navigating these situations gracefully, but they always reminded me of what I had sacrificed to achieve my independence and success. During my early 30s, several colleagues and friends got married, bought houses, and started families. I watched their parents participate in these milestones with excitement and pride, contributing both financially and emotionally to these major life transitions. I felt happy for my friends, but I also felt the weight of what it meant to navigate these experiences entirely alone. I had romantic relationships that became serious enough to involve discussions about marriage and family planning, but I struggled with the vulnerability required for these deeper commitments. Potential partners would eventually ask about my family background, wonder why I never mentioned my parents, and express concern about my apparent isolation from family connections. Some relationships ended when partners decided they needed someone with closer family ties, who could provide the kind of extended family network that enriches marriages and provides support for child rearing. Others ended when I realized that I wasn't ready to create the kind of intimate partnership that would require me to examine and potentially heal the family wounds that I had spent years learning to ignore. The professional recognition I received during this period was extraordinary by any measure. I was invited to join the boards of major education organizations, serve on advisory committees for federal agencies, and participate in international conferences where policy experts shared research and best practices. My work was influencing legislation that affected millions of students and families across the country. But success also brought visibility that sometimes felt uncomfortable given my family estrangement. When I was profiled in major magazines or interviewed on television programs, journalists would ask about my background and the experiences that had shaped my interest in education policy. I learned to tell my story in ways that focused on the policy implications rather than the personal drama. But I was always aware that my professional success was built on a foundation of family rejection that I had never fully processed. The financial security and professional recognition I had achieved by my early 30s represented everything my parents had claimed to value when they raised me. I was successful, financially independent, and making meaningful contributions to society through my work. I had exceeded their expectations for my career while proving that their financial support hadn't been necessary for my success. Yet, I felt no satisfaction in proving them wrong, no desire to contact them and demonstrate what I had accomplished despite their predictions about my financial irresponsibility. The validation I had once sought from them had been replaced by internal satisfaction and recognition from colleagues whose opinions I respected. I had built a life that was successful by any objective measure, but it was also a life that existed in complete isolation from the people who had raised me. The emotional distance I had created from my family had protected me from further hurt and disappointment, but it had also prevented any possibility of reconciliation or growth in those relationships. I had chosen to define myself entirely through my professional achievements and chosen relationships, leaving no space for the messy complexity of family dynamics that might require forgiveness, compromise, or vulnerability. As I approached my 32nd birthday, I felt like I had achieved everything I had set out to prove when I left home for Harvard 14 years earlier. I was financially successful, professionally respected, and personally independent in ways that exceeded my teenage expectations. I had built a life that was entirely my own, free from family obligations or expectations that might limit my choices or compromise my values. But I also recognized that the walls I had built to protect myself from family disappointment had isolated me from experiences that might have enriched my life in ways that professional success couldn't provide. I had no idea what it felt like to share major achievements with people who had known me since childhood, to receive unconditional support during difficult periods, or to be part of a family system that celebrated each other's success without keeping score. The life I had created was impressive by external measures, but it was also a life that existed in deliberate isolation from the people who had shaped my early understanding of love, support, and belonging. I had proven my independence so thoroughly that I sometimes wondered whether I had lost the ability to accept help or vulnerability that healthy relationships require. I spent my 32nd birthday alone in my beautiful townhouse, celebrating with expensive wine and takeout from my favorite restaurant. It was a pleasant evening, but it was also a stark reminder of how completely I had separated myself from family connections that might have made the milestone feel more meaningful. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. When I finally answered the 18th call, the voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in over a decade, shaking with emotion and desperation in a way that immediately transported me back to my childhood dining room, where everything between us had fallen apart. It was my mother, and the first words out of her mouth weren't an apology or an expression of how much she had missed me. Instead, she said the words that would force me to confront everything I thought I had resolved about our family relationships and the price of the independence I had fought so hard to achieve. "Jessica," she said, her voice breaking with tears I couldn't interpret, "we need your help. Your father is having emergency surgery tomorrow, and we don't have insurance to cover it. We're going to lose everything unless we can find a way to pay for this operation." The silence that followed her words stretched across 14 years of mutual stubbornness and pride, carrying the weight of every choice we had all made that had led to this impossible moment. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by all the evidence of my success and independence, holding a phone that connected me to people I had trained myself to stop needing, who were now asking for help they had no right to expect. The irony of the situation hit me immediately. My parents had cut me off financially when I needed their support to achieve my educational goals, and now they were calling me for financial support to address their medical crisis. The power dynamic had completely reversed, but the fundamental questions about family obligation, conditional love, and the price of independence remained exactly the same. I had spent 14 years building a life that proved I didn't need them, and now they were calling to tell me that they needed me in ways they had never been willing to acknowledge before. The conversation that followed would force me to decide whether the walls I had built to protect myself from family disappointment were strong enough to withstand this ultimate test of my resolve. The sound of my mother's voice after 14 years of silence hit me like a physical blow. I had to sit down at my kitchen island, gripping the granite countertop to steady myself as the familiar cadence of her speech brought back a flood of memories I had spent years suppressing. She was crying, which was something I had rarely witnessed during my childhood, and the desperation in her tone was unlike anything I remembered from our previous interactions. "Jessica, are you there?" she asked when I didn't respond immediately to her plea for help with my father's medical crisis. "I know this must be shocking to hear from us after so long, but we didn't know who else to call. We've exhausted every other option." I found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant even to my own ears. "What kind of surgery?" I asked, surprised by how clinical and detached I sounded. It was as if my professional training had kicked in automatically, helping me process information without becoming overwhelmed by the emotional implications. "Emergency cardiac surgery," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He had a massive heart attack yesterday morning. The doctors say he needs immediate bypass surgery, but our insurance was canceled 6 months ago when David lost his job. The hospital wants $150,000 up front before they'll schedule the operation." The numbers she mentioned were staggering, but not incomprehensible to someone who had spent years analyzing healthcare policy and understanding the financial realities of medical emergencies. What struck me most was the casual way she mentioned that my father had lost his job, as if this was a minor detail rather than a catastrophic life change that had apparently led to their current crisis. "When did he lose his job?" I asked, still maintaining the emotionally neutral tone that seemed to be protecting me from the full impact of what I was hearing. 8 months ago, she admitted, and I could hear the shame in her voice. The law firm he worked for was acquired by a larger company, and they eliminated most of the senior positions to cut costs. He's been looking for something new, but there aren't many opportunities for lawyers his age, especially in this market. I did quick mental calculations based on what I knew about their lifestyle and financial habits from my childhood. If my father had been unemployed for 8 months, they had probably burned through their savings paying for their mortgage, car payments, and the other expenses that came with maintaining the upper-middle-class lifestyle they had built over decades of steady professional income. "What about Lucas?" I asked, referring to my younger brother who would now be 31 and presumably established in his own career. "Has he been helping you financially?" The pause that followed my question told me everything I needed to know before my mother even answered. "Lucas has his own family to support now," she said carefully. "He and Jennifer have 2 young children, and they just bought a house in Denver. He's doing well, but he doesn't have the kind of resources that would make a difference in a situation like this." The implication was clear. They had already asked Lucas for help, and he had either been unable or unwilling to provide the kind of substantial financial assistance they needed. So they had turned to me, the daughter they had cut off completely, when I chose to pursue my education against their financial preferences, because they believed I now had the resources they needed to solve their crisis. "How did you get my phone number?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they had tracked me down after 14 years of no contact. "We hired a private investigator," she said, and the desperation in her voice became even more pronounced. "We know you've been successful in Washington, that you have an important job and you've done well for yourself. We're so proud of what you've accomplished, Jessica. We always knew you were special, that you would make something of yourself." The revisionist history in her words made me feel physically sick. They were proud of me now that they needed something from me, but they hadn't been proud enough to maintain any kind of relationship during the years when I was building the career they now wanted to benefit from. They had hired a private investigator to find their own daughter rather than simply calling me to rebuild our relationship at any point during the previous decade. "We always knew you were special," I repeated slowly, letting the irony hang in the air between us. "Is that why you told me to find my own way to pay for college? Because you were so confident in my potential for success?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement of the contradiction in her narrative. She wanted to reframe their rejection of me as confidence in my abilities, but we both knew that wasn't what had happened. They had cut me off because they disapproved of my choices and wanted to force me to comply with their preferences. not because they believed in my capacity to succeed independently. "We made mistakes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We know we handled things badly when you were leaving for college. We were scared about the financial burden you were taking on, and we thought we were protecting you from making decisions you would regret later." I stood up from the kitchen island and started pacing around my living room, looking at all the evidence of the life I had built without their support or approval. The artwork on my walls, the furniture I had chosen, the books on my shelves, the diplomas and awards displayed in my home office. Everything in my house represented choices I had made, goals I had achieved, and an identity I had created entirely independent of their influence or expectations. "You thought you were protecting me," I said, and I could hear the bitter edge creeping into my voice despite my efforts to remain neutral. "By telling me I was selfish and entitled? By saying I was manipulative and financially irresponsible? By telling me to get out and never come back?" "We were angry," she protested. "We said things we didn't mean in the heat of the moment. You have to understand, we were dealing with our own financial pressures at the time, and the idea of taking on additional debt for your education felt overwhelming." I stopped pacing and looked out my front window at the tree-lined street where I had chosen to build my adult life. My neighbors were successful professionals, government officials, and business executives who had achieved their positions through a combination of talent, education, and family support that had given them advantages I had been forced to create for myself. "What financial pressures were you dealing with?" I asked, genuinely curious about what had motivated their decision to prioritize their own financial security over supporting my education. Another long pause, followed by an admission that revealed more about their priorities than they probably intended. "Your father had some investment losses around that time," she said carefully. "Real estate ventures that didn't work out the way he had expected. We were trying to recover from those setbacks, and the idea of additional educational expenses felt like more risk than we could handle." So they had been gambling with real estate investments while telling me that paying for my education would be financially irresponsible. They had been protecting their ability to take financial risks with their own money while refusing to invest in my future because they considered my educational goals too risky for their portfolio. "And now you need me to take the financial risk that you weren't willing to take when I needed your help," I said, finally allowing some of my anger to surface in my voice. "This is different," she said quickly. "This is a medical emergency. Your father could die without this surgery, Jessica. We're not asking you to pay for something optional or frivolous. We're asking you to help save his life." The emotional manipulation in her framing was so obvious that it almost made me laugh. She was trying to make me responsible for my father's life while simultaneously minimizing the importance of the education that had enabled me to be in a position where I could potentially help them. My Harvard degree had been optional and frivolous in their opinion. But now my father's life depended on the financial success that degree had made possible. "How much do you need?" I asked, not because I was ready to help them, but because I wanted to understand the full scope of what they were asking. "The surgery costs $150,000, but we also need help with the recovery expenses and the bills that have been piling up since David lost his job. We're behind on the mortgage, the car payments, and several credit cards. We probably need about $200,000 total to get back on our feet and handle the medical expenses." $200,000. It was an amount that would have been unimaginable to me during my college years, when I was surviving on ramen noodles and working multiple jobs to cover basic living expenses. But it was also an amount that, while substantial, wouldn't destroy my current financial security. I had been saving and investing aggressively for years, and my current net worth could absorb this kind of emergency expense without forcing me into debt or dramatically altering my lifestyle. The fact that I could afford to help them made the decision more complicated rather than easier. If they had needed an amount that was beyond my means, I could have refused their request with a clear conscience, knowing that helping them would require me to sacrifice my own financial security. But because I could afford to help them, My refusal would be based purely on principle rather than practical necessity. "I need to think about this," I said, buying myself time to process the full implications of their request and my potential responses. "Jessica, please," my mother said, and the desperation in her voice reached a level that was almost painful to listen to. "I know we don't deserve your help after the way we treated you. I know we made terrible mistakes and said unforgivable things, but he's your father and he's dying. Whatever anger you feel toward us, surely you don't want him to die because of pride." There it was, the ultimate emotional manipulation designed to make me responsible for the consequences of their choices, while minimizing the legitimacy of my anger about how they had treated me. If I refused to help, I would be choosing pride over my father's life. If I helped them, I would be enabling their revisionist narrative about our family history and rewarding their decision to contact me only when they needed financial assistance. "I'll call you back tomorrow," I said, ending the conversation before she could apply additional pressure or make additional emotional appeals. I spent the rest of the day in a state of emotional turmoil that I hadn't experienced in years. I had built my adult life around the principle that I didn't need my family, that I was better off without their conditional love and manipulative behavior. But their crisis was forcing me to confront questions about my own values and the kind of person I wanted to be in situations where I had the power to help others, regardless of how they had treated me in the past. I called my closest friend in Washington, Sarah, who had become something like a sister to me over the years we had known each other. She was one of the few people who knew the full story of my estrangement from my family, and I trusted her judgment about complex emotional situations. "They want you to pay for your father's surgery?" she asked after I explained the situation. "After 14 years of no contact? That's incredible." "I know it's incredible," I said. "But the question is whether I should help them anyway. I have the money, and refusing would essentially mean letting my father die because I'm angry about things that happened when I was 18. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications of the choice I was facing. "What would helping them accomplish?" she finally asked. "Do you think it would repair your relationship with them, or would it just solve their immediate financial crisis?" I had been avoiding that question because I already knew the answer. Helping them financially wouldn't repair our relationship because our relationship had never been built on mutual respect and unconditional love. It had been built on their expectations and my compliance, and those fundamental dynamics hadn't changed just because our financial positions had reversed. It would solve their immediate crisis, I admitted. But I don't think it would change anything about how they see me or how they treat people who don't give them what they want. "Then you're not really deciding whether to save your father's life," Sarah said gently. "You're deciding whether to enable people who have shown you that their love and support are conditional on your usefulness to them." That night, I lay awake thinking about the different ways I could respond to my parents' request and what each choice would reveal about my own character and values. I could pay for the surgery and establish clear boundaries about future contact, demonstrating that I was capable of helping them without accepting their attempts to manipulate me. I could refuse to help them and maintain the complete separation that had served me well for 14 years. Or I could use this crisis as an opportunity to address the underlying issues in our relationship and attempt to build something healthier, going forward. Each option came with risks and potential consequences that extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis. If I helped them without addressing our relationship issues, I would be setting a precedent that they could contact me whenever they needed financial assistance, regardless of how they had treated me in the past. If I refused to help them, I would have to live with the knowledge that I had chosen my own emotional protection over my father's life. If I tried to use this crisis to repair our relationship, I would be making myself vulnerable to people who had already proven their willingness to hurt me when it served their purposes. I spent the next morning researching cardiac surgery outcomes, recovery timelines, and alternative financing options for medical procedures. I wanted to understand exactly what my father was facing and whether there were other ways they could address their crisis that didn't involve me. What I discovered was that their situation, while serious, wasn't as desperate as my mother had made it sound. Emergency cardiac surgery was typically covered by hospital charity care programs for uninsured patients, though the application process could take time that might delay the procedure. There were also medical financing companies that specialized in funding expensive procedures, though the interest rates were high and the terms could be onerous for people with damaged credit. The real issue wasn't that my father would die without my financial intervention. The real issue was that my parents wanted to avoid the bureaucratic hassle and financial consequences of pursuing other options. They wanted me to solve their problem, quickly and completely, without forcing them to deal with the complexity and indignity of charity care applications or medical financing. This realization shifted my perspective on their request in a fundamental way. They weren't asking me to save my father's life. They were asking me to save them from the consequences of their own financial mismanagement and the inconvenience of navigating the healthcare system as uninsured patients. When I called my mother back the next evening, I had made my decision. "I've researched your situation," I began, keeping my tone professional and emotionally neutral. "There are several programs available to help uninsured patients access emergency cardiac care. I'm going to email you information about hospital charity care applications, medical financing options, and patient advocacy services that can help you navigate these systems." The silence on the other end of the line told me that this wasn't the response she had been expecting or hoping for. "Jessica," she said finally, "we don't have time for bureaucratic processes. Your father needs surgery immediately, and these programs you're talking about could take weeks to approve. Emergency surgery for life-threatening conditions can't legally be delayed for financial reasons," I replied. "If his condition is truly critical, the hospital will perform the surgery and work out payment arrangements afterward. If it's not immediately life-threatening, then you have time to explore other financing options." "You have the money," she said, and I could hear the desperation shifting into anger in her voice. "You could solve this problem with a single check, and instead you're telling us to apply for charity like we're indigent." "I do have the money," I agreed, "but having money doesn't make me responsible for solving problems that other people created through their own choices." "Their own choices?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Your father didn't choose to have a heart attack, Jessica. This is a medical emergency, not some frivolous expense we're asking you to cover." "The heart attack wasn't his choice," I acknowledged. "But losing his job, spending 8 months without finding new employment, allowing your insurance to lapse, and failing to plan for emergency expenses were all choices. You're asking me to absorb the financial consequences of those choices because it's more convenient than taking responsibility for them yourselves." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation as my mother deployed every guilt trip, obligation argument, and family loyalty appeal she could think of. She told me that I was being cruel and vindictive, that I was punishing my father for mistakes he had made when I was 18, that I was choosing money over family when family should always come first. But I had spent 14 years learning to recognize these manipulation tactics, and I had built enough emotional distance to resist them. I listened to her arguments without being swayed by them, understanding that her distress was real, but that her proposed solution was designed to benefit her rather than to address the underlying problems that had created their crisis. "You cut me off completely when I needed your help to achieve my educational goals," I reminded her. "You told me that financial independence was more important than family support, that I needed to learn to solve my own problems without depending on others. You taught me that love and support should be earned rather than expected, and that family obligations don't override personal financial responsibility. I learned those lessons very well." "That was different," she protested. "You were young, and you had other options. Your father is 68 years old and he's dying." "It wasn't different," I replied. You had other options too, but you chose not to pursue them because you wanted me to solve your problem in the way that was most convenient for you. Just like you had other options when I needed college funding, but you chose not to pursue them because supporting my education wasn't convenient for your financial goals. I could hear her crying on the other end of the line, and I felt a momentary pang of sympathy for her distress. But I also recognized that her tears were at least partly manipulative, designed to make me feel guilty for maintaining the boundaries that protected me from being exploited. "I'm not going to give you money," I said clearly, "but I am going to help you navigate the systems that are available to address your situation. I'm sending you contact information for patient advocates, charity care coordinators, and financial counselors who specialize in medical emergencies. If you work with these people, you can get your situation resolved without my financial involvement." And if we can't?" she asked. "If these programs don't work or don't approve us quickly enough, will you just let your father die to prove a point about family relationships? If you can't get approval for charity care or medical financing, then we can revisit the conversation," I said. "But you have to exhaust those options first. You have to prove that you're willing to take responsibility for your own situation before asking me to take responsibility for it." "You've become so cold," she said, her voice filled with disappointment and accusation. "We raised you to be caring and compassionate, but success has made you selfish and heartless. You raised me to believe that love was conditional on compliance with your expectations," I corrected. "You taught me that family support came with strings attached and could be revoked when I made choices you disapproved of. Success didn't make me selfish. It made me financially independent enough to maintain boundaries that protect me from being manipulated." I ended the call before she could make additional appeals or accusations, and I spent the next few days researching the programs I had recommended to ensure that they had legitimate options for addressing their crisis. I wanted to be certain that I wasn't sending them down dead-end paths that would waste precious time if my father's condition was truly critical. What I discovered was that their situation was entirely manageable through existing systems, but it would require them to navigate bureaucracy, complete paperwork, and potentially accept charity care that might feel humiliating to people who had spent their lives considering themselves financially secure. They could solve their problem without my help, but it would be more complicated and less dignified than having their successful daughter write a check. 2 weeks later, my mother called to inform me that they had successfully obtained approval for charity care that would cover most of my father's surgery costs, and that they had arranged payment plans for the remaining expenses. My father had undergone successful surgery and was recovering well, though the emotional stress of their financial crisis had taken a toll on both of them. "I want you to know that we managed to handle this without your help," she said, and I could hear the mixture of pride and resentment in her voice. "We figured out how to navigate all those programs you recommended, and we got the assistance we needed." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, genuinely relieved that my father had received the medical care he needed, and that they had found a way to manage the financial aspects of their crisis. "But I also want you to know that this experience has shown us what kind of person you've become," she continued. "When your family needed you most, you chose to protect your money rather than protect your father's life. We know now that we can't count on you for anything, and we won't make the mistake of reaching out to you again." I recognized this statement as one final attempt at manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty about my decision and potentially change my mind about providing financial support. But I also heard it as a promise that aligned with my own preferences about future contact. "I think that's probably for the best," I replied. "You've made it clear that you only consider me family when you need something from me, and I'm not interested in relationships that are based solely on my usefulness to other people." "You're our daughter," she said, as if that biological fact should override everything that had happened between us over the past 14 years. "I'm your daughter when it's convenient for you," I corrected. "When I needed you to be my parents, you told me I was on my own. When you needed me to be your financial safety net, You suddenly remembered that we were family. I prefer the honesty of complete separation to the manipulation of selective family loyalty. After that conversation, I didn't hear from my parents again. Through social media and occasional Google searches, I learned that my father had made a full recovery from his surgery and that they had downsized their lifestyle significantly to accommodate their reduced income and the medical debt they had accumulated. Lucas and his family had moved closer to Phoenix to provide emotional support during my father's recovery, and they appeared to have rebuilt their family relationships around their new financial reality. I felt satisfied with the choice I had made to refuse their request for financial assistance while providing them with the information they needed to solve their problem through other means. I had demonstrated that I was capable of helping them without enabling their attempts to manipulate me, and I had maintained the boundaries that protected my emotional well-being while ensuring that my father received the medical care he needed. The experience had also clarified something important about my own values and priorities. I was willing to help family members who were facing genuine crises, but only if they were willing to take responsibility for their own situations, and only if they could treat me with the respect and appreciation that any relationship requires to be healthy and sustainable. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I could face the ultimate test of my independence and still choose to prioritize my own emotional well-being over family manipulation. I had been offered the opportunity to buy my way back into my family's good graces, and I had chosen instead to maintain the boundaries that had protected me and enabled me to build a successful and fulfilling life. The years that followed were marked by continued professional success, deepening friendships, and eventually a marriage to someone who understood and respected my boundaries around family relationships. I never regretted my decision to refuse my parents' request for financial assistance, and I never doubted that I had made the choice that was most consistent with my values and most protective of my emotional well-being. Looking back on that phone call and the impossible choice it presented, I realized that my parents had given me one final gift, though it wasn't the gift they intended. They had given me the opportunity to test the strength of the boundaries I had built and to prove to myself that I had truly learned the lessons they had taught me about conditional love, financial independence, and taking responsibility for your own choices. I had chosen myself over their manipulation, my emotional well-being over their convenience, and my own integrity over their attempts to rewrite the history of our relationship. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it was also the decision that finally set me free from any remaining doubt about whether I had chosen the right path, when I decided to build a life entirely independent of their support and approval. In the end, they had taught me exactly what they intended when they cut me off at 18, that family love should never come at the cost of your own dignity, that financial independence is worth whatever sacrifices it requires, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices. I had learned those lessons well, and I had applied them consistently, even when doing so required me to make choices that other people would never understand or forgive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.